Okay, many of you have heard me cover this many times in the past years, but we're in a different situation coming into this year, and I thought I'd update you on our current status, largely of our fungicide arsenal. So, one thing that's different in the last year and a half, we did change the name of the pathogen that causes cherry mildew to Podosphorus cerassi. You can still call it clandestina if you prefer that. What I'm going to cover today is just a very brief background on the pathogen and the disease, basic management recommendations, but I'm really going to dig deep into the fungicide situation, some background information, the resistance situation that we've found as a result of a research program, a generalized industry response to the situation that we're in. And keep in mind as we go through this, I fully realize that we're juggling a bunch of different balls in the air when we try to respond to do this. So at the end of the day, my advice is basically just do the best you can with the tools you have. And then I'll catch up on some other items at the end. Uh, the fungus that causes the powdery mildew produces two spore types, ascospores and Conidia. The ascospores are born in what are called chasmathecia, and the chasmathecia are these small, they are barely visible to the human eye, these small brown to black structures that are formed well into the epidemic. And this is actually the sexual stage of the fungus, source of genetic variability, but it is the only means of overwintering, that is getting our powdery mildew friend from year one into year two. The ascospores initiate the epidemic, and keep in mind that this is the only phase of the disease cycle that requires free water. The second spore type, or asexual spore, the Conidia, do not. They carry their own water within the spore. Okay, one thing about chasmathecia, if you have a lot in the wintertime going into the next season, high amounts normally mean that early season control is more important than, say, a normal year. Keep in mind that 2017 was our last real industry-wide hammer. We've had several years, you can find mildew, but what I consider a hammer is something that's industry-wide and something that brings the industry to its knees. So we haven't had one of those catastrophic years in quite some time. So vis-a-vis overwintered inoculum, I'm sure there's enough out there to get an epidemic started, but in terms of numbers, we're probably in pretty good shape compared to what we were in 2018. This is your typical powdery mildew on foliage. If you deal with cherries, you've all seen this, but once you get to this stage, this white to grayish mealy coating, it's actually the fungus producing its second asexual spore type, or secondary asexual spore type, called the Conidia. And it's this phase that's responsible for the spread and the intensification of the epidemic. So the ascospores, when they're released for the chasmathecia, initiate the epidemic, but the Conidia spread and intensify it. This is just a higher magnet or drawing of a powdery mildew on a leaf surface. They're superficial. The actual strands of the fungus that are growing horizontally are called hypha, and they stick a peg down into mesophyll cells with what's called an ostoриum, which sucks nutrients out of the host. And then the vertical structures are what are called conidiophores. And about once every 24 hours, a new conidium is produced at the apex of the conidiophore. And without the intervention of control measures, this can keep happening throughout the growing season. And keep in mind, this is a very highly magnified drawing, but keep in mind you can have probably 500,000 Conidia produced in any 24-hour period in a piece of leaf tissue that's the size of a quarter. So these spores, once the disease gets rolling, are produced in profusion. They're airborne. They can travel distances via air currents and wind. Now, in terms of distance, you can get significant travel. Say you have a severely infested cherry orchard, you'll have a significant amount of Conidia that are dispersed over a horizontal distance of about between 100 and 200 yards from there. But these Conidia can get up in the air and travel quite long distances in the air when conditions are good. And for example, Conidia of Erysiphene necator, which is the grapevine powdery mildew fungus, have been trapped in the air over the English Channel. So the infested grapes were obviously in France, and the spores work out in the air between France and Great Britain. So they can travel great distances. The important thing to remember about this phase is that it does not respect fences or property boundaries. In other words, if you have an infestation of mildew and you have a neighbor that has an orchard adjacent to yours, what's going on in your orchard vis-a-vis resistance because of this means of dispersal definitely apply to your next door neighbor. So to summarize the disease cycle, again, we're up here right now, and I put a circle around it just to again remind you that we haven't had a severe industry-wide epidemic in several years. So in terms of what we're dealing with on the fungicide challenge that we'll get to here in a bit, we're in pretty good shape compared to where we were in 2018 at this time. In other words, normally following a severe epidemic year, your risk for early infection is higher the following year. So again, those Chasmathes and ascospores initiate the epidemic, fly up to leaves where the secondary spore type or Conidia are produced. This phase can continue throughout the season, either until intervention occurs with fungicides or some other means, or dormancy occurs. So again, primary infection, secondary infection, repeating cycle, and then as the colonies age on the foliage, the Chasmathecia are produced, and that completes the disease cycle. So general management tips here, and I'm just going to go through this list. I'm not going to beat anything to death until we get to the fungicides, but again, pruning, suckering, irrigation delay. We found in many years in the absence of significant spring moisture that the initial irrigation set, if it's sufficient to wet the trunks, can actually incite the spore release that results in primary infection. So if you delay this, it actually delays the initiation of the epidemic. And in theory, if you delayed it long enough, it could shift the exponential phase of the epidemic to post-harvest. So it would reduce risk to your fruit. Fungicide programs, there's the approach, and the approach we use is largely one of protection. That is, protect young foliage and young fruit or developing fruit. The reason I stress protection here is it's far easier to protect against powdery mildew than it is to get rid of it once you have it. So the protection is the approach. We also suggest that the synthetic fungicides that pose a resistance risk, these be used in a protective fashion. And the reason there is that if you're protecting against mildew, you're not exposing as many individuals in the mildew population to selection pressure. Application, this is extremely important. Calibration is important. You really want to know how much you have in the tank, how much active ingredient. You also want to make sure that you're getting the recommended dose of the ingredient to the host. Coverage is extremely important, and spraying under good conditions is extremely important. And what I mean by conditions, I live in West Richland, and in the springtime when I'm driving the interstate up to Prosser, it hasn't escaped my attention, particularly in vineyards, that I see an awful lot of spray going up in the air on windy days. And when it gets up in the air a little ways, it becomes horizontal. And I don't know where it's going, but I can tell you it's not going on the adjacent vines. So it's important to get the fungicide to where you want it to do its business. And then of our available compounds, resistance management. And by and large, our industry's done a really good job of resistance management over the years. We we started using resistance-prone compounds back in 1988, and we have a pretty serious resistance problem right now. And frankly, I think it's a tribute to the industry that we haven't had a very severe situation like this long before this. So by and large, the industry's been very cognizant of preserving our fungicide arsenal. Fungicides come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. Some control mildew, some don't. But to put things in a historical perspective, and keep in mind, I came to WSU in the fall of 1986, and Ronald Reagan was still president then. And I didn't know what I was going to work with right away when I got to WSU. My first day at work, October 1st, I came in, and when I was walking down the hall to my office, I noticed that my office door was open and the light was on. And I went to go in my office, and there's a middle-aged man sitting there, a very friendly fellow, and he stood up to me and said, "Hi, I'm Tom Matheson, and I'm with Milk Growers, and you must be the new mildew guy." So that's how I got started working with cherry mildew. But back in '86, the only thing that we had registered for mildew control was sulfur, and we only had 10,000 acres of cherries at the time. So in '88, we saw our first DMI, or group 3 fungicides. That is, we used to call them the sterile inhibitors. We incorporated hort oils into the programs in '92. The QOIs, or strobilurins, group 11s, became available in '96. And again, this drawing is not to scale. 2001, quinoxafen, our only group 13 compound, became available. The SDIs, generally around 2010, those are the group 7s. And then we have several new modes of action that have become available during the last several years. So essentially, we have gone from Reagan to Biden. As you know, there's a lot of time and people in between there. So that's a bit on the history of our fungicide spectrum in cherries. And believe me, even with the resistance problem we have, we're still in a lot better shape than we were in '86. So a bit about chemical names. A chemical name, it's just given to a group of chemicals that share a common biochemical mode of action and may or may not have similar chemical structures. And the mode of action is of fungicides refers to the specific cellular processes that are inhibited by the fungicide. So some different modes of action for our mildew fungicides. Sulfur inhibits spore germination. The DMIs, are group 3s, inhibit membrane synthesis in the fungus. The SDIs inhibit respiration. The QOIs, or group 11s, also inhibit respiration, but they do it in a different place cellularly. U13 inhibits the formation of ostoria. Again, the ostorium is that structure the mildew puts down into the leaf to steal nutrients from the host. The quinolines, or Quintec, group 13, inhibit aprosoria formation. Aprosoria is a little platform the fungus forms when it's trying to get into the leaf on the leaf surface, and without which it can't get into the leaf surface. And then mineral oils disrupt cell walls and interfere with host contact. Okay, there's another phenomenon. I'm going to try to move something around on my screen here. I have a distraction. Okay. Fungicide site of action. This is really important as we proceed because it's how the different frac groups have been constructed. The target sites are specific enzymes in a cellular process to which the fungicides are binding. So in terms of the group 11s, the QOIs, or strobilurins, and SDHIs, group 7s, they both inhibit respiration, or the Krebs cycle. So they have the same modes of action. But how they do this each in a different manner. They inhibit respiration. The 11s inhibit respiration through cytochrome complex 3, whereas the SDHIs do it through cytochrome complex 2, they have different sites of action. And let me see here. So the mode of action is how a fungicide conducts its business. And again, the group 7s and both 11s inhibit respiration, for example, and the site of action is where those fungicides actually conduct their business. And looking at it on a cellular level, again, the mode of action of both the 11s and the 7s is the same. They inhibit respiration, but one group inhibits cytochrome complex 3, the other inhibits cytochrome complex 2. So they both inhibit respiration, but they do it at different sites. So that's where the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee comes in. It's called FRAC, and the URL is at the bottom of the page. And there are actually several different ways to get here. You could use that, or you could use frac.info. But the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee, it's an international organization comprised of plant pathologists that work in both the academic world, government, and in private industry. And they've broken these the FRAC groups down into committees whose responsibilities are specific different fungicide sites of action. For example, there's a group for the group 3s, there's a group for the group 7s, group 11s, et cetera, et cetera. So that number you see on the label of a fungicide, and I just use quash here as an example, where it says group 3, that means its site of action is group 3, and the 3 is the FRAC code. Resistance development, there's two different types. There's directional and disruptive. And again, if you look at resistance development over time, the far left is today and the far right is down the road. When you first expose the population to the fungicide, the population is comprised largely of fungi that are susceptible to the fungicide, but there may be a few resistant individuals in that population. Under continuous selection pressure from that site of action, gradually the proportion of resistant individuals in the population is going to increase. So over time, without mitigation and with continuous selection pressure, the number of resistant individuals in the population really increases. Two different types, directional and disruptive. I'll go with the disruptive first. This would be characteristic of the group 11s. And this is a situation where nearly all individuals in the population are susceptible to the fungicide when it's first introduced, but a few are immune. And then all of a sudden it just collapses. The proportion of the latter or of the resistance increase with selection pressure. This is characterized by a very, very rapid loss of control, and there is cross resistance with this type of resistance, particularly in the group 11s. Now, the other type of resistance, and we've been over this before years ago with the DMIs, is directional, or what I would call shades of gray. The response to the chemical is dose dependent, and selection pressure pushes the least lethal dose higher over time. And this is the type of resistance we see in the group 3s, DMIs or sterile inhibitors. And this resistance can be overcome by raising the rate, but keep in mind you get to a point where you have to go off label with the rate to get good control, so that's no longer an option. But this is characterized in the field by a gradual loss of control. That is, you think your mind's playing tricks on you, where you have a favorite DMI compound. And this, we really saw this with the early in the our chemical history with things like Raleigh and Rubigan. When they first came out, they were just amazing. In fact, I was such a fool that right after we got Raleigh labeled, I said at I think it was at the Cherry Institute, I said that our problems with mildew are history. that's how well it worked. Well, here we are 20 some years later, and I'm still talking about mildew. So I was really wrong there. But over time, I started having people contact me, saying that, hey, this doesn't seem to be working like it used to. I'm still getting control, but I have to spray more often, or I have to keep raising the rate. Well, that's a really good indication that the population's shifting. And if you're the person in the orchard day to day and you see this with your own eyes, don't think you're going crazy. Take a look at your the components of your spray program. Excuse me. So looking at this in terms of population, the number of colonies is on the vertical axis, and here is the qualitative resistance is very, very sudden. This is the group 7s and group 11s. One spray time it works and works quite well, and then it all of a sudden collapses. It's just that the resistant individuals totally take over the population. With the quantitative, it's more gradual, and it's a gradual shift from a predominantly resistant to the compound population, or I'm sorry, sensitive to the compound population to a resistant to the compound population. Okay, and there's cross resistance. It's pretty well understood in the group 11s. If you get resistance to one member of the group 11 group, it imparts resistance to all members of that frac group. So, for example, if you get resistance to gem or trifloxystrobin, you're also going to get cross resistance with cabrio or pyroclostrobin. It's also present in group 3, but it's less well defined and understood due to the quantitative nature of the resistance. So now where the cross resistance is really important is when we start talking about fungicide choices. And as you know, some of our best fungicide choices for powdery mildew are premix formulations of different frac groups. So let's go back to gem or trifloxystrobin, and again, the 11 in there is the frac group. If we get resistance to trifloxystrobin, it's obviously also resistant to the trifloxystrobin of fluopyram. And with pristine, there's also cross resistance, so there's also resistance to the pyroclostrobin component in pristine. So remember, part of the rationale for using these premixes is that there's two different modes of action in them. And when they're fresh off the shelf, the mildew is sensitive to both mode of action. So you have built-in resistance management. Okay, if one of these no longer is effective against powdery mildew, but you're still using it, the 7 component in the case of pristine is boscalid and fluopyram with Luna sensation. It is still effective against mildew, but you're not tank mixing it or using a premix and managing resistance to it. So it's I always thought that the premixes, I liked them because they had built-in resistance management, but I was always concerned about a situation like this. And again, all the 11s, if you get resistance to one, all of the 11s on that page are resistant. For example, if you have used gem exclusively from this group and you have resistance to gem and you've never used cabrio or pyroclostrobin, there's also resistance to cabrio or pyroclostrobin. Okay, I'm not going to beat this to death, but the cherry powdery mildew pathosystem is a very, very high fungicide resistance risk pathosystem. We have to spray multiple times. Epidemiologically, this disease can be very, very explosive. It has a very, very high reproductive rate. Its rate of spread is very fast. Again, it can move in the air. The basic pathogen biology, again, there's a functional sexual stage, and where there's a functional sexual stage, that's where crossing over and genetic recombination occurs. So it's a source of genetic variability. And that there's some of that genetic variability certainly has to do with the response of fungicides. And then the fungicide site of action, a multi-site versus single site compounds. The multi-site compounds, the resistance risk is far, far lower. So some of our current fungicide choices, the group 11s, group 7s, group 3s, 13, and some of our newer groups, U6, 50, and U13. So the old QOIs or strobilurins, the SDHIs, those are the succinate dehydrogenase inhibitors, demethylation or sterile inhibitors, Quintec, and then some of our newer compounds. And then we have multiple contact fungicide choices, sulfurs, oils, biologicals, carbonates, and zinc salts. Fortunately, these contacts are generally in low resistance risk categories. So a research program that we started in 2018, funded by the Washington Tree Fruit Commission and Oregon Sweet Cherry Commission, and then the Commission on Pesticide Registration and the Northwest Nursery Improvement Association in 2020 we used this to look at fungicide resistance in group 11 and group 3. Actually, the project started investigations on group 3, and as we dug deeper and deeper, we realized that we had a bigger problem than just the 11s. So that handsome fellow on the bottom right is Prashant Swami. He worked in the lab as a postdoctoral plant pathologist for several years and did an absolutely wonderful job on this in terms of bioassays and molecular biology studies. But he found in the group 11s, 43% of the isolates that we sampled were resistant, and 28% of the group 3 isolates were also resistant. Now, one thing I will say right here, we know that the occurrence of this resistance or geographical occurrence is widespread. Every different growing area where we sampled, we found the resistance. What we don't know is how bad it is in each area, which would be the subject of another study. So the situation that we were in, I call this the before slide, and you can see this big long list of available fungicides for cherry mildew. Some of them group 11, some group 7s, group 3s, some old ones in there, and also some new ones. One of the new ones is Miravis, which is a group 7. Another is Sevia, a group 3. So these are the synthetic choices before. And now that we know about the resistance to 3 and 11, this is essentially what we're left with after. Now, in terms of the group 3s that we've dropped out of this, we have no idea other than we've documented resistance there, but what we don't understand is the nature of the cross resistance. Supposedly, the Sevia, it's a new group 3 compound, reportedly has a unique binding process. So we really don't know how that fits into the group 3 story. But as you can see, when we go from before to after, we have really limited our choices. Fortunately, we do have some non-group 3 and 11 options and some desired outcomes. Keep in mind that the group 7s are also effective against mildew. And I put Luna Privlege up here because Luna Sensations is one of the best tools that we have. And again, it's a group 11, group 7 mix. And with resistance to the group 11s, I'm a little worried about the group 7s. If you still want to use Luna or the fluopyram, the active group 7 ingredient, if it's available, you can use Luna Privlege. A new group 7, and again, the Privlege and Miravis and Fontellus are all standalone compounds. A new one is Miravis. It's a group 7, and keep in mind that you have to manage resistance to these. These are available, they're effective against powdery mildew, but you Preferably need to tank mix them with another mode of action and always alternate them with a different mode of action. You know, sulfur is relatively cheap and it's a very effective fungicide. So it never hurts to throw sulfur in a tank with any of these single site of action compounds. Then some of the newer chemistries, Gatton, Torino, and Vivando. Again, these are mildew, good mildew compounds, and Quintec is still available. So we still have options. Now, one of the recommendations in other areas they've had problems with group 3 and group 11 fungicide resistance has to do with what's called a fitness penalty. And what a fitness penalty is the frequency of the resistant population will decrease when the selection pressure is removed. So in other words, the fitness penalty, if the selection pressure is removed, it reverses the process of resistance development that I talked about earlier. So in many cropping systems, what they do in situations like this, they will put those groups, sites of action on the side for a year or two. So what we'd like to do going forward here, do not use group 3 or 11 compounds for the upcoming growing season and next, if at all possible. However, there are going to be situations, whether it be you're worried about some post-harvest diseases, MRLs, et cetera, you might have to use one or both. Use alternate chemistry and also use good good resistance management techniques for the synthetic options that remain. What I'm most concerned about right now is not managing mildew. It's managing mildew and putting our remaining synthetic chemistries at risk for resistance. It's really what I don't want to do is burn out some of the newer chemistries we have while we're trying to revive the older chemistries. So in terms of resistance, do you have it or not? If you aren't certain, but you've had some challenges managing mildew, I would assume that your strain is resistance. Now, some evidence for resistance, rapidly increased difficulty managing mildew in your orchard, a general decline in mildew control over the seasons. This would be a real good indicator that there's a problem with group 3s in there. And importantly, catastrophic control failures in your neighbor's orchard. Again, the Conidia of this fungus can move by wind, so they can easily move from orchard to orchard. And this doesn't mean that you need to go over and shame your neighbor. What it means is you need to be on the same page vis-a-vis your fungicide approach. So if you've already purchased group 3 or 11 compounds, or you have in storage, or you have no other options given the circumstances, use no more than once the entire season. That would be one shot of group 3, one shot of group 11. Tank mix with sulfur or some other frac group. Use the higher labeled rate. Know the contents of your fungicide program. This is particularly important with the premixes and with if you get a fungicide recommendation that's only a trade name. You also need to have the common name of the chemical and also the frac group number when you look at your season-long program risk. Ensure that your fungicide dollars actually reach the tree and the fruit. Again, coverage and calibration is extremely important. Plan ahead. We have options, but there may be MRL and PHI issues with the alternatives. And really get on the same page with your neighbors and colleagues about your local disease or mildew management programs. It's very important that you know what your neighbors are doing and that you work together and try to attack this problem as an industry. So the 2021 growing seasons, looking at table 1, cherry fungicides containing group 11s. you can see Abound, Cabrio, Gem, Luna Sensation, Maravon, Pristine, and Quadras Top. And I put an off-centered box there because some of those premixes in the red box, some of those premixes contain a group 7. And without the active group 11 component in the premix, remember that we no longer have built-in resistance management to the group 7 component of that premix. And then some cherry mildew fungicides containing group 3 compounds, Rally, Procure, Top Guard, Sevia, Unicorn, Quadras Top, and some generics. Again, with the Sevia, it reportedly has a unique binding site in the fungus that may make it behave differently than the other group 3s. So this is something that if you're interested, you should look more closely into with the manufacturer. And again, I don't want to beat this to death, but the important thing about the group 11 premixes, if you lose lose one to resistance, in this case group 11s, it puts more resistance pressure on the remaining compound in the premix. So Luna Privlege, this is registered in Washington State, and it's registered on stone fruit, but I don't know much about its availability. It was pretty scarce several years ago, so that's why I said here that it's elusive. But it is the same thing, fluopyram, as the 7 component in Luna Sensation, and it's effective against mildew and some post-harvest rots. But again, if you're using this in the tank, be sure you tank mix it with something else that's effective against mildew, sulfur or some other appropriate mode of action. The same thing with Miravis. It's a group 7, good mildew material, but we have to manage resistance to it. Now, something that came up a few weeks ago were post-harvest cherry pathogens. And one of the comments that were received was some people felt that these premixes, the 11-7 premixes, were also giving the added benefit of improving post-harvest pathogen control. And I looked into this a little deeper. And again, you don't want to put on a 7-11 premix by itself if the 11's no longer controlling mildew. But you also have to worry about, in some cases, post-harvest pathogens. So there are other compounds that can either go in the tank or be used post-harvest that can help with post-harvest pathogens. And one of those is fludeoxonil, known as either Scholar or FDL, or Elevate, fenhexamide. These compounds will also control post-harvest cherry pathogens such as botrytis and brown rot. And they're relatively effective. If you look down here, and this again comes out of California, Pristine gets 3 stars on brown rot, gray mold, and rhizopus, as does the fludeoxonil or Scholar. And the fenhexamide gets a 3 for gray mold and 2 for brown rot. And again, this particular chart is out of date. It is now registered in the state of Washington. So in terms of our current Lifeline, and I consider our current Lifeline the 7s, group 7s, and all the new synthetic frac groups we have. We need to approach this as an industry that we're all on the same page. The university, packing houses, distributors, consultants, and growers. Try to give the groups 3 and 11s a rest to preserve them long term. Try to take advantage of the fitness penalty. Get the fungicide to the target. And most importantly, while we're dealing with this situation, be sure to manage the resistance to the newer synthetics, such as the 7s, the 50s, etc. The non-synthetics that remain, and again, we could use Fontellus or Miravis or fluopyram here, apply no more than twice per season, and you may see this on the label that you can use twice in sequence. My personal recommendation while we're in this situation, no sequential usage. Always tank mix with another mode of action and always use protectively. And okay, I've already said this before. So I'll go through a little bit that we know about the remaining compounds. Again, fluopyram, remember to use an effective Group 7 companion product tank mixed with this. There are tolerances to this: US, Mexico, the European Union, Australia, Canada, China, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Miravis, Group 7, pre-harvest interval of 0, REI of 4 hours, but importantly, tolerances US and Mexico, European Union, Australia, Canada, Japan, and Korea. I need to move something here. Gattin or fludionyl U13 compound. It inhibits Ostorium formation. This is a pretty unique mode of action. Pre-harvest interval is 3. It's locally systemic, and tolerances in US, Mexico, European Union and the UK, Canada, Japan, and Korea. Vivando, Group 50. The mode of action, it disrupts the recognition process between the tree and the fungus. Pre-harvest interval 7 days, locally systemic, and tolerances US, Mexico, EU, UK, Australia, Canada, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Torino, Group U6 compound, mode of action unknown, but the company that Gowan that makes this is extremely concerned about resistance to this compound. So they recommend its use infrequently. Comparable efficacy to other fresh synthetics, tolerances US, Mexico, EU, UK, Australia, Canada, Japan, and Korea. This is what we're shooting for. I mean, this is the bottom line. But if we can take advantage of the fitness penalty, we may get back to an even greatly expanded fungicide toolbox for the management of cherry powdery mildew. Now, in terms of MRLs, I used a couple of sources to get some of the basic information here, but I found 2 really good sources of information, and you will need to dig into this deeper. One is some work that Tori Smith has been doing over the years, and it's posted on the Tree Fruit Research Commission website. A lot of information about minimum residues, maximum residues, medium residue, et cetera, and it really puts these MRLs into like a real world perspective in terms of what's happening in our cherry orchards. Extremely valuable, and maybe I skipped over it. Well, the slide was embedded, but I found the export manual in the Northwest Hort Council on the Northwest Hort Council website extremely informative in putting this together. So I'm not an expert on MRLs and marketing, but a lot of the information is available about this. So in summary, back to the Group 3s and Group 11s, I realize the situation we're in here, and we're not going to be able to eliminate their use entirely. Some of you may not be in the situation where you have any options at certain times a year. But what I'm getting at here, let's really try to minimize their use for the next couple of years and take the selection pressure off of them.